And now I am also very happy to introduce Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd is known from many of you. He was the 26th Prime Minister of Australia. I should say Australia because even though I have a French accent in English, I like sometimes to have French Australian accent in English. So he was the 26th Australian Prime Minister of 26th Prime Minister of Australia, and he's currently the president of the Institute, Asia Society Institute. He's also a scholar. You know, he's very well known for his knowledge of China, and he speaks Mandarin. If you want him to speak Mandarin, he can do that. And he's also a wonderful speaker, as you will see. And tonight, there is no real title for his speech. There are just 3 key words. Well, I repeat what he told me. No, the first one is Trump. Well, the second one is global order. So here, when I heard that, I thought that there was something wrong. Maybe it was global disorder, but he said global order. So Trump, global order, and the third one is UN. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thierry. It's good to be back in Doha. It's good to be here in the Gulf with so many of our friends from the Arab world. And it's good also to be with so many fellow global citizens from right across the world as you address this great challenge of global governance for the future at this World Policy Conference convened by the French Institute of International Relations. Yes, Thierry, we have major language qualifications in Australia. I speak 3 languages. My first is English, my second is Chinese, and my third is Australian. And the reason why you have those interpreting devices on your table is to assist you with the translation from Australian into English. You've had a big day at a conference. There's a prepared text here, and if Thierry is interested, I'll have it posted online with your conference series. But let me go to the essence of what I wanted to talk about this evening, which is where do we stand today on the core question of the future of our global order? And secondly, how is that affected by the current state of great power relations? And thirdly, are our current global institutions capable of sustaining the challenges which the 21st century is delivering to them? When we talk about global order, as you know, Henry Kissinger has spoken a lot about this subject, as have many others who are practitioners and theoreticians in the field. But global order is an elusive concept. If we look at the order that we've constructed together since 1945, broadly it would fit within 3 core elements. One is this reality of great power relations, those who framed the order back in 1945. The second is the institutions we created themselves and whether they are functional or not in delivering the public goods of global governance. And thirdly, we have this proliferation now across the policy domains of non-state actors. And the one we often focus on, and increasingly focus on, is the operation of terrorist organisations committed to global disorder as part of their core mandate. As a practitioner in international relations, but also someone who takes its studies seriously, I fear where we have reached in our current international discourse on global order. In this increasingly postmodern, in this increasingly post-factual world of ours, it seems to be assumed that order is inherently self-sustaining. The truth is, for those of you with a mind for history, is that it is not. In fact, if we look at periods of order in international relations compared with periods of disorder in international relations, we would conclude rapidly that the periods in which we've had something called an order is in fact a small period of time in the whole span of history. In fact, you could further argue that the natural condition of international relations is disorder. And it is only in recent times, relatively recent times, have we fashioned the institutions and the agreements and the overall machinery of an order based on rules which is capable of sustaining the peace. Therefore, my argument very simply is this. If states around the world today wish to sustain the institutions of global order that we've constructed post-45, these are not inherently self-sustaining. They in fact will require conscious, deliberate effort by nation states to reinvent them, to re-energize them, to reform them, in order to sustain them for the new mandates we have for them for the future. Order is not the natural condition of international relations. In this ahistoric, postmodernist, post-factual world, we seem to have collectively forgotten what global disorder looks like. It is only one lifetime ago that we had full manifestation of what disorder looks like. That is a relatively short period of time. And my simple assumption for the purposes of the remarks here to you tonight is that order is infinitely better than disorder. And for those reasons, we have a combined effort to reinvest in the institutions and rules which govern our current global system. Let me go to the first of the elements of what we call the global order, and that is the state of great power relations. And for the purposes of our discourse here this evening, without wishing to offend a single person in the room, let me concentrate on three great power relations: Russia, China, and the United States. As we stand here this evening and sit here this evening in Doha, I think it is fair to argue that the current state of great power relations is the worst that we have had in at least a quarter of a century. This is not a normal time. It is an abnormal time. Let us go first to the question of US-Russia relations. When we have senior Russian spokesmen speaking international forums, talking about the fact that we are now approaching a new Cold War, this should cause each of us to sit up and pay attention. It's remarkable that what we have called the post-war order was able to see us through a Cold War of 40 years over the last 70 years, and through a time where the possession of nuclear weapons was at a scale on the part of the two superpowers that we avoided a global conflagration. But here we are in the year 2016, and the state of Russia-US relations is poor indeed. You know the causal factors. I do not need to list them here. From the invasion of Iraq through to NATO enlargement plans concerning Georgia, Ukraine, through to Russian actions in the Ukraine, the current failure to agree on a common course of action in Syria, the nature of cyber warfare declared and undeclared between Russia and the United States, and until very recent days, the accusation by the US administration of Russian interference in the US presidential election process. These are not normal times. The state of the Russia-US relationship post-91 is abnormal, and that is the reality we face. When I look at the other dimension of that particular triangle, which is US-China relations, what I see also is a set of relations between those two countries which are arguably the worst that we've seen since, again, Tiananmen, and arguably back to the days of normalization in 1972. And again, you know the list, whether it's East China Sea, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's, again, the tensions which arise from cybersecurity or a range of other deep strategic divides, which are growing. And so these relations between the United States and China and the United States and Russia are of themselves fundamental to ensuring that the institutions of global governance, led by the United Nations system, are in good working order. And it's a very simple proposition that the institutions of global governance work most effectively when the relations between the great powers is in reasonable working order. And the reverse applies as well. And that is where we find ourselves now, but with one addition, and that is the new strategic accommodation or condominium reached between Russia and China themselves. So the question arises in the unfolding story of these great power relations, what now happens under President-elect Donald Trump? How much of what he has said in this election campaign is to be taken at face value and how much is not? If you look particularly at what Donald Trump has had to say about the future relationship between Russia and the United States, it should cause us to think about the extent to which, in fact, a process of normalization will unfold. If President Trump is serious about normalization, and if you look at the continuing tenor of his discourse during the election campaign, we would have to conclude that at least an effort is about to be made, whether it will succeed or not, foolhardy or otherwise, to reach a form of accommodation with Russia both on the key outstanding questions of Ukraine and Syria. A key Russian interest, of course, lies in the ending of financial sanctions. Will that be able to be achieved as a consequence of Trump's efforts at normalizing the Russia relationship is an unknown factor. But there is a new dynamic at play. This is no longer a static equation, as it has been for the last several years. On the US-China relationship, there is in fact a reverse set of dynamics which have been released. If you look again beyond the detail and the content of each and every individual statement by Donald Trump during the campaign, what you do see on the China relationship with this, a very simple and continuing conclusion that American economic woes, from the loss of jobs through to the destruction of industries, through to the destruction of old industrial towns, has largely, not exclusively, occurred as a consequence of unfair trade relations with China. I take this set of statements seriously from Donald Trump, in part because it relates so directly to his domestic economic narrative. His message is clear. The American economy and its recovery in large part will depend upon what he describes as fair economic relations with the rest of the world, most particularly with the People's Republic of China. Those, therefore, who have assumed, I think superficially, through a popping of champagne corks in Beijing, that there has been a welcoming of President Trump's arrival into the Oval Office, I think actually belies a more fundamental truth that there is deep concern in Beijing as to what the uncertainty represented by Donald Trump will actually mean. Number one concern in Chinese foreign policy, in my experience, is a preference for certainty. With Donald Trump, you do not have certainty from their perspective. You have large uncertainty. Number two, the core to China's domestic stability and the core to its rising global power is, of course, its economic strength. And Donald Trump's narrative goes directly to that core question: the future of China's open trading relationships in the rest of the world, and in terms of his stated determination to declare China as a currency manipulator within his first 100 days, similarly in terms of the fairness of the valuation of the renminbi. Therefore, on this element of global great power relations, what I see unfolding is one of the most difficult periods that we have seen in US-China relations since 1972. This goes to the core of China's economic agenda. How this will actually unfold, given that none of us know precisely what President Trump will do, and how much of what he has said is campaign rhetoric and how much will be translated into presidential policy, none of us finally know, least of all President Trump-elect at this time. But if we identify those two core continuing themes, one about normalizing with Russia to the extent that he believes that he can, and two, an agenda in terms of the restoration of American economic power, for which protectionist measures and a particular focus on China is the core element, I believe we are in for a particularly interesting time. Our Chinese friends, you know the familiar curse, may you live at interesting times. The problem with our times, my friends, is that they are far too interesting, and we would all prefer them to be less so. Let me speak briefly about the second element of what we call our global order, and that is the health of our global institutions. I do not think it's exaggerating that if you look at the state of our global institutions, whether it's the United Nations, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., that we see increasingly our global institutions being walked around by the nation states of the world to find solutions elsewhere to chronic global problems. Let me take just for a moment the example of the United Nations itself. So many of the challenges that we've faced on global peace and security in the last decade or so have involved decision-making processes and solutions outside of the UN system, as people have found the system too cumbrous, the requirements of unanimity within the UN system too difficult to obtain, and as a consequence, the institution is often left as a diplomatic afterthought once decisions are taken elsewhere. There's a problem which arises from that, my friends, and that is if you cease to use an institution effectively and consistently to resolve global problems, the institution itself starts to creak, it starts to groan, and it starts in time to become functionally irrelevant. No one can challenge the inherent international legal legitimacy of the United Nations system. We formed it collectively in 1945, and those of the other 145 or so nation states which have joined since have accepted the Charter as the foundation for what we seek to do in dealing with the great problems of global peace and security. But our actual use of the institution on effective global problem solving, ranging from North Korea to the Iranian nuclear deal, in fact has become increasingly scarce. I welcome, therefore, the election of Antonio Guterres, who will be, in my judgment, a strong Secretary-General. But the challenges which Antonio Guterres will face will be of a structural nature and not simply a management systems nature as he deals with the future of this particular global institution. For the last several years, 2 years in fact, I have chaired the Independent Commission on Multilateralism in New York, looking at fundamental root and branch reform proposals for the institution in order to make it as effective as possible in dealing with the global policy challenges we have for the 21st century, in peace and security, in sustainable development, in human rights, in humanitarian engagement, and on more basic questions of budget, resources and management. Those proposals are there. Others will be put to the Secretary-General as well. The extent to which an improvement in Russia-US relations at the great power level assists in grinding the machinery of the UN into better working order in the future is an open question. I hope that it does, as that will remain the core of it. But the institutional relevance and flexibility of the UN machinery of itself requires separate engineering and separate work in terms of the proper functioning of the machinery. We have to be confident that the institution remains relevant to the core challenges of global governance for the 21st century. Because if we do not have the machinery in fine working order itself, then frankly our ability to deploy the machinery to deal with the challenges of our time will in fact be an investment of good faith which will not be reflected in the reality which they produce. Which brings me to the third and final element of my remarks to you this evening, which is not simply the state of great power relations, not simply the state of our global institutions where we have increasingly a tendency for people to walk around them rather than to use them, but thirdly, the proliferation of non-state actors. You're familiar with the phenomenon. Not all of it is bad, in fact much of it is good, but not reflected yet in our global institutional machinery. We've just had now from our friend from Korea a presentation on what a mighty corporation conglomerate does by way of its own corporate responsibility programs in the world. But if you simply apply a piece of mathematics which is to look at the principal corporations of the world, their combined assets held in the private domain, against the public assets held by many governments in the world. Private corporations are now infinitely larger players in what constitutes global action, decision-making, and problem-solving than many of the institutions that we have in the public domain. This is unavoidable because we had an unfolding global economy. The challenge for the United Nations system, through a new framework of global partnerships with firms such as that led by our Korean friend, is to harness increasingly the forces of global private capital into the work of sustainable development of the United Nations system. Unless that happens, we're going to have this small rump of UN funding over here around an institution which is increasingly beginning to look moribund, where most of the world's financial resources will in fact lie elsewhere. That's unsustainable. Of course, there's another arm in terms of what's happening with non-state actors as well, and that's the rise of civil society. Again, this is a good development. But when we see, for example, Gates Foundation and its health programs vastly better resourced than the World Health Organization, we should begin to ask ourselves the question, where does the future lead us in terms of the future of civil society relative to the institutions of global humanitarian governance or sustainable development, which we've created ourselves? And so the answer there again must be a rewriting of the contract whereby we bring in the institutions of civil society with the formal institutions of the United Nations system and the bank and others through a new approach to global partnerships which has us working in the same direction. Let me give you one simple example which relates to both corporations and civil society. We as an international community 12 months ago agreed on something marvellously called the Sustainable Development Goals. Have you heard of them? These are an important fabric of what we've agreed to in terms of the final elimination of extreme poverty in the world. However, once you look at those goals, all 17 of them, and the 157 or 63 targets within those goals, and ask yourself the next question, where is the source of public finance to be delivered to turn these goals into reality? The mathematics does simply not add up. Overseas development assistance, ODA, represents about $140 billion a year and declining. Even a basic assessment of what is required in terms of the infrastructure investment to make the Sustainable Development Goals deliverable takes you into the trillions, not into the billions. And already our existing budget allocations to the UN system and to the global development banks, the public development banks, is in decline. So unless there is an effective partnership, a new global partnership between the United Nations system, the World Bank, and global private capital and global civil society, the Sustainable Development Goals we've all put our hands on our hearts and agreed to as noble aspirations and proper aspirations for elimination of poverty in a sustainable fashion will simply fade away. And I conclude with this observation about another element of non-state actors, and that's simply the operation of terrorist organisations. In many respects, we have seen another wave unfold with what we see with ISIS, ISIL, Daesh across Iraq and across Syria. We have seen the tragedies unfold in many cities across the world, primarily those in recent times of Europe, but elsewhere in the world as well, and not just in the developed world. And we see increasingly terrorist organisations deploying various technologies and financial resources with a core stated or unstated objective, which is to destroy the interstate system, which in fact we have subscribed to. If there is one unifying cause which is relevant to all great powers, China, Russia, the United States and others, and all other states, it is to make common cause for the elimination of terrorist organisations of this type, because it is a common threat to the order which unites us all. But as yet that has not obtained the galvanising force which it should in the discourse in international relations that we see unfold in the three major capitals of the world. Globalisation is a perverse thing. We have landed our nation states in a position whereby the challenges we face globally are in excess of the powers now residing within national governments and nation states themselves, yet those nation states at the same time are also expected in terms of political accountability to solve problems which are now beyond their financial and policy scope to solve. leading to a crisis of the nation state and its credibility. You see that across Europe. You see it as it's unfolding in many countries across the world. Yet at the same time, we see our global institutions and regional institutions, such as the European Union, insufficiently empowered in order to deal with those problems which are definitionally become supranational. We are falling into no man's land between nation states no longer powerful enough to deal with problems which go beyond their borders, but supranational institutions not powerful enough to deal with them either. The consequence is the delegitimization of both, and that is the dilemma that underpins the various elements of the global order that I've referred to so far. I conclude with this. By instinct, as with many of you, I elect to be an optimist in terms of the dynamics of international relations and where they take us in the future. None of us should adopt some passive determinist view of international relations history, that these are forces somehow beyond our control. Nation states, including the great powers, get to choose whether the order is in fact going to be sustained or allowed to fall apart brick by brick, whether in fact we are going to see death by 1,000 cuts to the principal institutions we created back in 1945. This will be a choice, a public policy choice for leaders, for politicians, for bureaucrats, for diplomats, from countries which are both great and small. But I sense the possibility that despite everyone's deep skepticism about the arrival and the emergence of President Trump and everything that he stands for in terms of the forces which are alive in domestic politics of the United States, that there may be some silver lining here in terms of the underpinning surgery necessary to some of the elements of great power relations in order to make some of the systems of global governance work more effectively into the future. That, however, will only work if all states, great and small, join with a common resolve and a common understanding that the institutions of global governance we have created together are not self-sustaining, the order is not self-sustaining, that in fact the forces of inertia and entropy and in fact ultimate destruction of global institutions will occur and unfold unless we move decisively through conscious action in the reverse direction. Nation states create orders through conscious political effort and resolve to do so. There is no such thing as business as usual and standing still. At the point at which institutions and an order are created, the processes of decay automatically begin, unless we are consciously in the business of reinvestment and renewal. That must begin with the great powers themselves. And so let us hope, let us urge, let us work with the Americas, the Russias, the Chinas of this world, other strong powers, other middle powers and other smaller powers, constructive powers who are united in a cause of ensuring that a global order which is rules-based is sustained into the future. In the absence of that, we return to disorder, for which unfortunately the norm in international relations history should cause us great pessimism and concern to observe what the consequences would then be. I thank you.